Good afternoon, everybody. It's my privilege to organize this panel discussion on PCOS, adolescent to midlife under the aegis of AUGD in association with Sun Pharma Inca division. To moderate this session, we have our esteemed and very senior teacher of all times, none other than Professor Dr. Abha Mazumdar. Madam is a professor, director, head, Center of IVF and Human Reproduction, Sir Gangaram Hospital, New Delhi. Madam is recipient of n number of awards. She got President's Medal for Best Medical Graduate. She is recipient of awards for DMA, Vikas Ratna Award, Chikitsa Ratna Award, Lifetime Medical Excellence Award, Abdul Kalam Gold Medal, Rashtriya Gaurav Gold Medal. Madam is the icon of IVF of North India. She is course director of FNB and she has many publications in national and international journals and she's also peer reviewer. She has trained so many postdoctoral specialists IVF all over the India. We have also a galaxy of panelists. Dr. Sonia Malik, Madam, the Director and Head Health and Fertility and IVF Center, New Delhi. Dr. Neena Malhotra, she is Professor, Department of Obs and Gynae and IVF, AIMS, New Delhi. She is also Secretary of IFS. Dr. Sangeeta Sharma, she is Consultant IVF and Reproductive Medicine, Jaipur. Without wasting any time, I hand over proceedings to Dr. Abha.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I welcome you all to this webinar and my panelists also. I have lovely panelists and I'm sure that we all will be able to bring home some take-home message for everybody on this important subject of polycystic ovarian syndrome, which starts from adolescence as soon as a girl crosses her menarche, and it extends right into midlife till 45 years of age. And as you've been introduced by Dr. Mala, I have Dr. Sonia Malik from New Delhi, one of the great teachers, Dr. Neena Malhotra, another great teacher, and Dr. Sangeeta Sharma, who is a very lovely budding teacher and a great student from who's done fellowship from the national board and topped her batch also. So we have a galaxy of panelists, and I'll shoot out all the questions after I just brief you about a little bit about PCOS in women of reproductive age. And if you see anything, 5 to 15% in women from 15 to 45 years is a huge number of patients. All of us, as gynecologists, as obstetrician, as infertility specialists, do get our share of PCOS women who come to us, especially the infertility specialist, where almost 30% of women present with possibly underlying PCOS. And if we look at women with menstrual problems, then over 90% have PCOS. So this is the extent of this disease in our population. PCOS is a spectrum. So the most minuscule of this spectrum would only show maybe polycystic ovaries on ultrasound, and that is all, no symptoms whatsoever. However, when we go on expanding this spectrum to a maximum site, then we could have all type of presentations which start from dermatological to menstrual to metabolic evidence and of course ultrasound evidence. Having said that, why do I want to tell you the epidemiology of PCOS? Because there is a ethnic predilection as well as hereditary, and out of the ethnic predilection, South India and Maharashtra have enough papers to show that we Indians have the highest incidence probably in the world for PCOS. Why is it important to classify PCOS? We all look at women and say, oh, maybe she's PCOS, but then we have to use certain criteria to make sure that she's rightly diagnosed as PCOS, because once we tell a woman, oh, you have polycystic ovarian syndrome, it worries her a lot. So unnecessarily, we don't want to put women with menstrual irregularity, with hirsutism or acne classified as PCOS. So we need an accurate diagnosis, and once we make an accurate diagnosis, we need to see the health risk associated with clinical manifestations, and we also need clarity on ethnic groups and risk as per ethnicity. Having said that, there are three important classifications which emerged from time to time. First, the NICHD classification, which came in 1990, then the Rotterdam, which became very, very popular in 2003, and then the Androgen Access Society reclassified PCOS only to tell us that this is the high risk group and this is the low risk group. And having said that, I will finish here showing what is the criteria. The NICHD and NIH definition said there were two things: hyperandrogenism and menstrual irregularity with chronic anovulation or oligo-ovulation, and both need to be met. But then Rotterdam came in and they said, oh, polycystic ovaries is also a third important criteria. And out of hyperandrogenism, menstrual irregularity, and polycystic ovaries, we need at least two to be classified as PCOS. And then came in the Androgen Access PCOS Society in 2006, which said, well, if there is no hyperandrogenism, there would be very low risk later in life to these women. So hyperandrogenism and ovarian dysfunction are two important things. Maybe polycystic ovaries or ovarian dysfunction, one out of this, but definitely hyperandrogenism should be there to say that this girl is PCOS. So having said that, I'm coming to our topic. What is our target audience today? The target audience is endocrinologist, dermatologist, and then obstetricians and gynecologists. As you see in this pie diagram, a major subset is obstetricians and gynecologists. Then oncologists also need to know about PCOS. Cardiologists also need to know. Women healthcare societies and associations also need to know a little bit about PCOS, and clinical toxicologists also need to know. Now I come to my panelists. We will discuss the whole panel in three phases: the adolescent problems, which mainly look into dermatological problems, and menstrual problems where they have a long bleeding time, heavy bleeds, and delayed bleeding. Then we come to the fertile life, where anovulation, oligo-ovulation lead to a lot of subfertility. And all of the above may also continue in the fertile life. And then we come to midlife problems like diabetes, all the metabolic syndrome, and endometrial cancers. These two need to be looked into midlife, say after a woman has finished her family, have sort of planned her family, has had children, then we need to continuously still look for these problems. So I come to adolescent PCOS to start with, and I would want Dr. Sonia Malik to emerge on the screen because I have a few questions for her. She's the one who's going to answer most of the adolescent PCOS at the moment. And Sonia, my question to you is, what are the concerns of diagnosis of PCOS in adolescent girls? And how do we diagnose PCOS in an adolescent girl?
Thank you, Abha. Thank you very much. And good morning to all of us over here, as well as all those who are logged on to this wonderful panel. Let me start with the adolescent part of the PCO. As you all know that adolescent PCO is something which is becoming more and more common in the country, and as Abha has stated, there is a variation in the number of cases that we see across the country. Some reports are suggesting a very high incidence of PCOS, whereas the others are saying it is around 10%. So basically even 10% is a lot, and we all know that the problem with adolescent PCOS, adolescence per se, is that this is a transition. And it's not just a transition of the physical appearance of the person, but also the psychological development that is taking place during this period. And therefore, these signs and symptoms of PCOS are actually overlapping with the physiological changes that are taking place during this puberty. And hence, what happens is that the so-called Rotterdam consensus criteria that we are following all the time may not be very applicable to us, and therefore we have to be very careful when we are diagnosing a person as PCOS. So let us see what we would definitely be wanting when we are actually looking at this criteria. And as you can see over here in this chart, that the three classical features of PCOS is oligo-ovulation, hyperandrogenism, and polycystic ovaries. And if it is a mishmash of this, all three of them combined, which give rise to the classical features of PCOS, the four phenotypes that we are very, very familiar with. But in cases of PCOS in adolescents, this is basically just a combination of the abnormal uterine bleeding, which is very visible to the mother or to the person herself, and secondly, the hyperandrogenism. But what has been said is that at least 2 years of persistent symptoms must be present in order to label a person as PCOS. And similarly, the hyperandrogenism has to be moderate to severe hirsutism, so that mild acne would be present even at puberty. So therefore, the extent of hyperandrogenism and the extent of abnormal uterine bleeding is something that we have to understand, and the kind of bleeding pattern that we have would also be important. However, as far as the ovaries are concerned, we know that the ovaries are showing a PCO-like morphology at this point of time in the adolescents. And therefore, now, according to the new international guideline, which was published about 2 years ago by the Australian group of Teed et al., and it was recommended by ASHRAE and ASRM combined, and even the Indian societies have recommended that. It states that at least 8 years post-menarche, an ultrasound is not required in adolescents, because that is the time that the ovaries are actually developing. And therefore, it is too early to label a person as having PCO based only upon the ovarian picture. So that is one thing which our mothers are very concerned. They will come to you with an ultrasound report of a girl saying, "मेरे को ultrasoundologist ने बोला है कि इसको PCOS है." So we have to be very careful in labeling a person as PCOS. But yes, even a PCO morphology has to be looked at very carefully. If she has the other features, yes, then she probably is having a PCO, adolescent PCO.
Yeah, very nicely explained, Sonia. And I think the audience has really got your point that ultrasounds are not to be taken as a lone feature of PCOS. So please don't trust the ultrasoundologist if he says you have PCOS. Ask
Yes.
your gynecologist. Next question is, what are the tests you would apply in your medical practice? Tell me the minimalistic test
Yeah,
for these young girls to establish the diagnosis of PCOS.
Again, if you can you look at this chart, again, it tells us that, basically when you're looking at the two features, that is of irregular periods or oligomenorrhea, and also for evidence of hyperandrogenism, then you have to understand that the tests would also be, something which are going to talk about these two features clinically. And the optional tests are, of course, the ultrasound, like I said before, and of course, the very severe acne. But what is not recommended, therefore, if you look at the tests here, the hormonal tests which are recommended are only to be done if we are not sure of what we are looking at, because we do not want to just keep on doing the hormones, the FSH, LH, estradiol in adolescents. But in case she has prolonged amenorrhea and you do want to know what exactly is happening to her, then yes, they are recommended. But the other tests, the DHEA, 17-hydroxyprogesterone, are actually required to see what kind of a hyperandrogenism this girl has got. If it is very severe, you have to rule out the other causes of hyperandrogenism. Hence, you do need to, classify them according to what is her clinical feature. The testosterone levels which are actually promoted or said that yes, you have to do the free and total testosterone. That is a test, yes, it is required, yes, I agree, but then you have to understand that your lab has to be very good and the parameters have to be absolutely correct. Therefore, every testosterone level or every free and total testosterone is something to be taken with a pinch of salt, because we all know that these hormones can play a lot. You may not get the exact level, and yet you may label this patient as having severe hyperandrogenism. So therefore, please do be careful. But a standard deviation of 2 or more than 2 is said to be good when you are assessing the testosterone levels. However, having said that also, please do not forget the basic two tests, that is thyroid and prolactin. They have to be done in these girls, because basically we have to rule out those causes also of having irregular periods, as well as having a bit of hyperandrogenism along with that. For the metabolic parameters, nowadays, yes, Abha. For the metabolic parameters,
nothing. You go ahead,
it has been written over here that you are fasting insulin, but we all know from our own practices that this is not recommended. Nobody is doing insulins now. None of the societies is recommending fasting or PP insulin as tests to diagnose PCOS in any stage of life, whether it is adolescence or infertility or post, at the menopausal age. But I'm sure the others will talk about it. Just one more word. There is another test which everybody is using right, left, and center. That is the AMH. At this point of time, I would like to say that in a young girl, AMH should not be used as a diagnostic measure for diagnosing PCOS. That is something to be remembered. AMH is not going to help us in this class of patients. Let us see. We will be talking about it later as well. So I think
Yeah.
that is all that we need to do. Very few tests for them. It is
So
more or
when
less
do
a
you
clinical
start,
diagnosis.
Sonia? Thank you for your clarification that we need very few tests. The hormones are not required. Sometimes maybe testosterone, DHEAS, and very severe hirsutism. 17-hydroxyprogesterone looks important. And metabolic features, maybe a OGTT and lipid profile. That is all which looks good in these. When do you start treatment for these young girls?
But there are two schools of thought. One, of course, is that you patiently wait. But the other school of thought is basically that though definitive diagnosis is required to initiate treatment, because primarily it is clinical. This treatment is clinical. We are facing
I
and
agree
what
with
we are
this.
seeing, right?
Absolutely.
And you see, if you're starting treatment early, you're probably sort of dampening the effect of the disease, and therefore you may be preventing the metabolic syndrome. In those patients, if you say you see an obese hirsute girl, you tell her about lifestyle modification and you tell her to lose weight, you're helping her. So therefore, even if it is physiological, you have to be careful that this itself may be a risk factor for developing PCOS later on. So that is given in our IFS guidelines, that all these have to be considered as risk factors for later on developing PCO. So hence, starting a treatment only primarily on the basis, say suppose the patient has come to us with amenorrhea, then you can start her on treatment just thinking that she may eventually end up in a PCO. Let me just initiate the treatment. So that kind of a thing is important, but of course, a regular follow-up of the symptomatology is definitely warranted in order that we see that this girl is not going to progress into a full-blown PCOS as she grows older. That is important. So, and like I said, in our city-bred girls, especially, not in the villages so much, but at least in the cities, obesity is on the rise, even in the school children. And that itself, we have to actually rule out metabolic syndrome. There are studies from PGI Chandigarh which say that there is an incidence of 7 to 8% patients having metabolic syndrome at adolescence. So we really have to be careful in what we are, looking at, and therefore, the earlier the better. So start treatment as soon as you think that this patient might have got PCOS, and this is also the recommendation of the International Adolescent Group of Pediatricians, where they also recommend the same. This reference that you have mentioned over here is actually a consensus of document of the pediatricians, which do say that as soon as you think that this patient is having PCOS, please do start treatment.
All right. Thank you, Sonia. We'll go
Yeah.
very fast because we are running out of time.
Please.
Just therapeutic goals of treating adolescent PCOS.
So again,
Just tell the most
lifestyle.
important things to the audience so that they can take home a message here.
If you can see over here, the goals are you have to have menstrual regularity. That is, you have to correct the irregularity. You have to basically, there is a lot of loss of self-esteem in this child. So you have to look at the cutaneous manifestations of hyperandrogenism, which means the hirsutism and the acne, which is bothering her. And of course, if she has any comorbidities, you have to settle those. So as we all know, the first thing is lifestyle interventions, weight loss and exercise. Then you talk to her about laser and the local therapies. Laser, of course, would be the last, I would say, the other simpler methods. But of course, these days the children are resorting to laser first of all. And of course, you can even give anti-androgens, OCPs. OCPs actually form the first line management after lifestyle, because we are gynecologists and we know that we can sort of correct this by just giving her OCPs. Both these things can be corrected. Both the menstrual irregularity and the hyperandrogenemia can be corrected by these. And these are the various classes that we have. We can also give her insulin sensitizers. There have been many studies. Metformin and inositols are the two insulin sensitizers which are given, and of course metformin is now recommended, but inositol still lacks a lot of evidence. Yet we have started to use it as well. A combination
Now
of
we
this
come to
would
the
be required.
question which you
Yeah.
have. Sorry, are you still
No,
speaking
no,
on
it's fine.
something
It's
here?
fine. It's fine. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So do you think now you already told us that AMH is not a valuable marker for diagnosis of PCOS, especially in adolescents, but where there is a diagnostic dilemma, would you think of doing it, Sonia?
See, Abba, that's a great question. Actually, what was happening till about 2 years ago, till this guideline came out, when we were saying that when you cannot diagnose
कौन सी है
PCOS
बताओ?
on ultrasound, because abdominal ultrasounds are
नहीं
what
तो
are
नहीं
being
बताओ.
done for this group of patients, we are doing abdominal ultrasounds, and because of the obesity, the ovaries cannot be seen well. So in those cases, it was said that
दिखाई
okay,
दे
you
रहा है
do
मुझे.
an AMH to see whether it is, this is a PCOS or not. That was the recommendation that was suggested. It was never the recommendation. And that, yes, can hold true even now. If it is a very obese girl and you do not know, then maybe you can do an AMH. But again, I would again want to reiterate that if you have the two classical features of irregular periods and hyperandrogenemia, you don't need to do an AMH to say that this is a PCOS. That is
All right.
still
So
the criteria.
we've got very relevant answers from you, how to diagnose, what test to do, what is the diagnostic dilemma, how to treat these girls, because their main concern is their obesity, and yes, menstrual irregularity, bleeding episodes become very important now. From here, AMH variability, I'll just remove this slide. We'll come to the infertility segment, Sonia, and if
Yes,
anyone
please.
wants to
Thank
pitch
you.
in between with answers is most welcome to. But let me know, because on the screen I can see only Sonia and nobody else.
No, no,
So
you
I
can
don't know.
you can make it. I can see all of you. I can see all of you. Abba, make it
But
into multiple. You'll be able.
I don't know how to make it into multiple recipients, but it's all right as long as I can see the speaker. I'm happy. Now we come to the infertility segment, which Nina will take over and answer most of the questions. Hi, Nina.
Hi, good afternoon, ma'am. It's good afternoon now, and thank you very much for having me in with those very, very learned panelists that are around. It's really an honor and a privilege to be sitting just talking to the
It's so
audience
good
and,
to
of
have
course,
you on
answering the
that.
questions.
It's so good to have you at the panelist end, because I'm sure you will give absolute answers to the audience where they know in one line they understand what is the treatment they should go ahead. One question I want you to answer: are all PCOS girls infertile?
No, not all PCOS girls are infertile. I really will not be able to give you a percentage because this will vary from a country and also from which age group she is. Because if she's 20, 29 versus, if we look at the criteria on the phenotypes, we know that we have got the major four phenotypes A, B, C, D, and of the phenotype C are the ones who will have hyperandrogenism and the PCO morphology, or they will be ovulating. So they'll be actually ovulatory. Having said that, it doesn't mean that 25% of the patients would be having no fertility issues. But overall, if I looked at literature, around 28 to 30% of women would have spontaneous conceptions. So
Excellent.
all
I'm so glad that you've clarified this. Hello?
okay. The next thing that you
I'm
asked me, I
glad
think
you
is
clarified this, because once we label PCOS to a girl, the family gets very disturbed that will she ever be able to conceive? So 30% will conceive naturally. What is the reason of infertility in these women? And we leave this here. What are the approaches in managing infertile girls with PCOS? What are your approaches? Because now they've come to you that they want a child. They've already been managed during their adolescence by one of our colleagues who has given them regular periods, has stopped the excessive bleeding, has treated their hirsutism dermal features, and they just want fertility now. How do you go ahead?
so. I think the first part, what is the causes? I think it's a very long-ending conditions or associated. We just understand that these girls or these young women have got a hypothalamic, or a neuroendocrine problem where the LH pulses are high, the amplitude is more, so they're tonically high on LH. At the ovaries, we know that their follicles are not maturing, they're atretic. Of course, we know that there is an AMH problem also besides the insulin resistance. And the AMH, we mustn't forget, is the one which is inhibiting the recruitment of the follicles, the primordial follicles, to go to the antral follicle pool and also excite. I would say that AMH is inhibitory to the response of this follicle to FSH. So having said that, when it is infertility, I just put it as a metabolic approach and a reproductive approach, i.e. metabolic meaning simple things, which Dr. Sonia has already highlighted, is the lifestyle modification. But on the metabolic approach, since there are as many as around 70% of the obese PCOS and around 30 to 40% of the lean PCOS will show insulin resistance. So the second aspect of the metabolic approach would be adding them insulin sensitizers and of course leaving bariatric surgery to a very few, maybe just 5 to 7% who have definite indications. On the reproductive approach, I would put it as looking at going up to see and tackle them in a stepwise manner from the simple medicines to orals and going on moving ahead to perhaps gonadotrophins and of course just maybe around 15 to 20% of them needing actually IVF therapy or ART in the forms of in vitro fertilization. Now talking about the lifestyle, I think weight reduction is very important. If you look at the ASHRAE guidelines, it said a woman may just lose 5% of her weight, of her body weight is sufficient enough to help her induce ovulation. So from anovulation to ovulation, 25% of them may start having their spontaneous ovulation if they check their weight. And I think it could be divided into three parts, looking at their diet, exercise, and of course behavior strategies. That's what I would say. It's rather easy to say, but if you really talk to a PCOS woman who is obese, I think it takes a toll because it's not about losing, it's about sustaining the weight loss, which is very important. And I've just picked this from the guidelines, but I tell you, these are all fancy things. This is how you just cannot tell your patient, look, just go and take 500 to 700 kilocalories a day or reduce it from this. I think it's very important that you look into what our eating habits are, what is the background, what is the social background, and how can you tailor make that rather than just give them on your prescriptions, look, go eat just 500 kilocalories. I think a lot of things would be, you could again look at what are their timings at which they're eating. And in the current situation where people are high profile, they're working at nights, late night shifts, again, the kind of eating they have, the binging is very common when they're working late nights, and that's when they tend to overeat. Of course, exercise is very important, again, guidelines, but whatever exercise they do has to be sustainable. And as I said, the ASHRAE says that a weight loss of just 5 to 10% can bring about a reduction of 30% in their weight, central fat, as well as an improvement in their insulin sensitivities and improved ovulation. So that's the take on lifestyle, I would say.
Nina, now we have understood lifestyle is very important, and whatever helps lifestyle, maybe it is diet, maybe it's exercise, maybe it is medicines which sensitize them more to insulin and their own insulin starts working for them. But apart from that, we come to frank fertility problems where all that is happening on one side. It may happen, it may not happen. She may be able to reduce weight, she may not be able to reduce weight. So we just don't go on with that. We have to leave her at some point and say, now you need proper fertility treatment. How do you initiate ovarian stimulation and which are the drugs you use? This is the first part of my question. And the second part is, do you think letrozole is a first-line drug now? And if it is, why do you think so?
I think once we know that she is on the lifestyle, but I think we can always start, stimulation of her ovaries, considering that infertility is a major concern.
It is simultaneous that we go in with both the things. Right.
Yes. So you just can't say you lose this weight and come back. That will not be the take. So it can be, it is what is important.
The patient will run away from you.
Yeah. So I think as we talk about stimulating the ovaries, with the newer consensus coming up from the ASHRAE, we are shifting from clomiphene. In fact, we had, but again, coming to say back that it's the drug whom we lost in for almost a decade is back to us, and I would consider it, yes, definitely the first line therapy for reasons which are very many. But then again, clomiphene is because it has got a response which is monofollicular. It is easy to take. what we get is it's more friendly on the endometrium. And if we look at a back-to-back kind of batch to, which you can stimulate, since this drug doesn't have a long half-life, unlike clomiphene, which stays in the body for up to 45 days, this has a shorter half-life, and therefore this is preferred and to be considered, I think, today in today's age as today's day as the first line. Of course, we can't say that we have cannot give clomiphene, but I think I would prefer, and what the guidelines say is clomiphene, letrozole.
Yeah,
And
the
if we look at the
guidelines say
trials,
that practically,
hello,
sorry, you go ahead. Yeah.
yeah. So I think it's to be said with the newer data that's being added, particularly the landmark paper which came in the NEJM from Richard Legro's group, which was a trial which was done in the US at a time where the US FDA had not approved and still was not approving of letrozole. They had taken women, 750 women, and what they found was the live birth rates were higher with the letrozole group as compared to the clomiphene, higher pregnancies, and what's good, since it gives you a monofollicular, the fear of having multiples is lower with the letrozole. So that are major, benefits. But what the major concern of, having congenital malformations, this group really gave the answer that there were no major anomalies in the letrozole group. And of course, I think the concerns which really put the Drug Controller of India to put this drug on hold have also been obviated, because we have data both from the Japanese registry and also from the registry which is from India, from Professor B. N. Chakravarti, which clearly says that the risk of malformation is not higher than clomiphene or any other group. And I think this paper itself says that not only were the live birth higher, the pregnancy rates were higher, and also the endometrium was more favorable with the letrozole group.
So this is what brought letrozole back into use after all the controversies of taking it away because of the congenital malformation rate.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, then we can go for the next question. Do you think injection human chorionic gonadotropin is mandatory in these ovulation induction cycles, Meena?
Well, I think this is something which I would want to say that if you look at once you're stimulating them and their, the hypothalamic pituitary and the ovarian axis comes into action, then they are secreting their own LH. So if you look at it, they actually don't need, because of their own endogenous LH, they will be able to achieve ovulation. If I can recall, there is a good meta-analysis which came from Polyboniakis group, way back in 2007 or 9, which we looked at all the prospective and retrospective studies that had been done on women who were being stimulated with clomiphene, and they compared whether they gave them HCG triggers vis-a-vis they tried their LH surges, which was endogenous, by using urinary LH kits. And they found that there was no difference in women who underwent
Right.
IUI post HCG or post LH, which was a natural LH which was followed.
Okay.
However, having said that, I think we are more keen to giving them HCGs, because, as a physician, we are more in control, because, we're going to call them at 34, 36 hours later. But what's very important is, I think we're adding to the cost, because, women will have to be spending more money in, getting their LH kits done. And of course, I think it's the interpretation that's very
There
valid.
is a
But otherwise,
small little part to this question. Should ovulation induction be followed by timed intercourse or IUI? So maybe no HCG if they are going for timed intercourse, but maybe HCG only when we are
yes,
planning IUI, because we can control the cycle better. Do
yeah.
you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there are a couple of papers also, though not very large, which have said that when you're following them up with timed intercourse, you may perhaps, but this is one which says that IUI, if you compare
It's a
IUI versus
higher
time
pregnancy
intercourse,
rate.
yes, that IUI would definitely give you better pregnancy rates and higher clinical pregnancy rates than you just leaving the patients on a time intercourse.
Right. So we now go on to oral ovulation inducers. HCG is optional and IUI is also optional, especially if after 3 to 4 good cycles of ovulation, the girl doesn't conceive. Now, what is the role of insulin sensitizers in ovulation induction for PCOS women? I just want you to brief us. What are the insulin sensitizers available to us? And what is your experience with use of these sensitizers?
See, we've gone to accept that insulin resistance is part of the game, not just obese, but even lean PCOS. So insulin sensitizers definitely have a role to play. What we've had at hand is metformin and myoinositol. Just inosytols have just been added up. Of course, we've been trying and we've been relying on the metformin as for the ECOG and the ASRM guidelines, which clearly say that metformin, if used alone versus placebo, does benefit. Metformin, when added to clomiphene, improves the pregnancy rates vis-a-vis just clomiphene alone. Now, we've used it, but we do understand that when we give them, we should give them for at least 10 to 12 weeks prior to giving, because that's the time when you need for the insulin resistance to improve. And of course, minoxidil, which may be considered a new kid on the block, but not any more new because we have sufficient experience and our own trials which we've published. But this is a large paper. This came in a journal which was very impressive, that it had large numbers of over 3,500 women who were PCOS, whom they gave up to 4 grams. And they found that the pregnancy rates were higher. But you look at the small numbers of this subgroup which they gave to even IVF patients, and they found that in the larger group, which was non-IVF, ovulation was restored in 70% of women, and the pregnancy rates improved, dramatically in this group. And therefore, if I come to put on the entire literature that I could review, it clearly says that minoxidil is as good as metformin in terms of improving the pregnancy rates. But a very big advantage which comes here is that it is not got all the side effects which metformin gives up, even at a dose of 4
I
grams.
think that's a
Whereas-
very good statement. I think that's
And
a very
therefore-
good statement.
Yeah, and I will share you our results also, 2 of our papers which are coming up, one's
Yeah.
published and the others in the process. And we found that the side effects in IVF patients, which tells them to sort of drop off the treatment, was higher in the metformin. They have more of, nausea, vomiting. And therefore, that's the reason why I would say myostatin would be preferred. There's one publication from one of my colleagues, Dr. Rita Mai, who was published in Gynae Endocrinology, where they gave a combination of metformin and myo versus metformin. And therefore, they found that this showed that the combination worked better than just giving metformin alone. And perhaps I think we can't say it's a synergistic effect, and we put a big question mark because we haven't done the molecular level and haven't done the intra-ovarian levels, or just that we could do is also HOMA-IR in these patients. The HOMA-IR fell better in the myoinositol group than the metformin alone.
So
And also that
your study
yes. Yes,
also
this
says
is a
the
paper
same,
which we presented in ASRM last year, and also we got this is in process. We've already sent it to Gynae Endocrinology, and we are hoping that it should get accepted, which was a randomized trial. We went not head on head. We didn't do a combination. We just gave pure myo, no combinations, and we just gave pure, metformin. We found that the OHS's risks were lesser in the myo group, but what was very important is that we had more compliance in the women who took myoinositol, and also the quality of eggs that we got
maybe
were better.
compliance becomes a very important factor
Yes.
with myoinositol, though OHSS is less by both and both improve the outcome. So let's go ahead because this is so good for myoinositol, and it's really getting a place in ERT treatment as well as in infertile PCOS. And having said that, a little bit about gonadotropins, Nina, that just to let the gynecologist know that what is the biggest cliche which is there when we are using gonadotropins and what precautions we need to take. I mean, no right, left, and center giving the normal doses which one uses for unexplained infertility or IVF. So a little detailing, a short detailing to the audience, what are the do's and don'ts for giving gonadotropins? Over to you.
I would say that gonadotropins is not the first line. Definitely, it's a second line by whatever guidelines or our experience. But remember, somebody who is giving gonadotropin should not be a novice, should be somebody who's seasoned, who has the physiology of not just PCOS, but of ovulation induction, and learns the art and science, and it's at the back of his hand or her hand. Because, when you have problems with gonadotropins, troubleshooting is maximum when you give it with PCOS. We do understand there's a cost, there's a problem of using, they need more intense monitoring. But what's very important to recognize that if they sort of they sort of kind of start bursting and they start going haywire with over response, we have to be very judicious. And I think for this reason, if you're using gonadotropins in
what are the highest
PCOS,
doses you would
it's
want to?
Yeah.
What are the highest doses
I would
you
just
would
say
want
that
to
if you're
start
using
or
it,
use?
yeah, I think the first cycle itself is a trying or a testing cycle. It's a titration
Yes.
dose. So
Yes.
if you're knowing her profile, I think it'll be guided a lot by what is her BMI, what is her AMH levels, And I think in gonadotropins, I would definitely depend on using the AMH levels to guide me besides the antral follicle counts, and also looking at what is the level of hyperandrogenism, because that again tells me if there are very high AMHs, I would put them aside. I would not tell somebody like a general gynae to touch them, because obviously, not that they cannot, if they
Right.
have the experience, or rather consult a senior colleague or refer them there. But a chronic step up low dose is what's very good. Again, this kind of a protocol would need patience. But I would not say that don't the smallest humble dose one could start could be 37.5. But then I think a counseling is very important to look to the woman. If you're starting this, you probably need to be longer with us, not that the standard, 12 or 14 days of stimulation. And there are papers that say that
Very
you
important
start
point.
start at 50 to 100, and this is actually with Recagon. But if you start with 75 and show small increments of maybe just 37.5 or lower. So if you
Right.
understand this, this would only happen in a unit which has got a backup to handle a complication which happens with them.
Right.
That is OHSS. So that is
So
something which
very,
is very
very
important.
important. And it is a second line agent only after clomiphen or letrozole has failed with combinations or otherwise. And now I come to your last question. Does ovarian drilling have a role in treating infertility in women with PCOS? I'm very
Yeah,
glad
I
you
think
brought in the important points about gonadotropins, that they have to be used in smaller doses, small increments, and one has to have experience because of the explosive side effect of OHSS, which can happen in PCOS more common. So it is better to
and I think we
refer
should
unless,
we we should add that
yes,
your threshold to cancellation and a PCOS should be low. So don't feel, oh, 4 or 5, let me go ahead and do it. That's something I think which I forgot and was there on the slide.
I
Yeah,
think,
coming.
it is, you can't cancel anything. You just avoid intercourse for the patient and don't give her a trigger ever. So that would probably let the cycle die off quietly, right?
Yeah, I basically mean don't trigger them. That's what I mean by canceling.
Yeah,
So
no
yes,
trigger and no
ovarian drilling.
intercourse.
Yeah, I think that's very important. So ovarian drilling, I think all the panelists and all the people in the audience would agree that 5-7 years, the number of drilling that we are doing has really come down drastically. And I think we're all worried to touch the ovaries, no matter how minimal we may touch. But yes, there are some situations where we would resort, particularly to patients who've got very high LHs, i.e., something which is going in the range of 20s, or perhaps where they have got an image which is like really very high. But I wouldn't say that that should be the primary. It again is a second or rather a third line therapy that I would put it in today's day, considering
Right.
that drilling has got its side effect in terms of damaging the ovaries, even if we go overzealous, and of course the risk of having adhesions that could form. But yes,
Thank
earlier
you.
we were more prompt in taking them for CC failures or previous OHSs. I think now with our understanding, availability of letrozole, better use of insulin sensitizers like myonositol, the risks of OHSs are reducing. But I think we just leave them for just a few patients now.
Nina, this was so nice that you gave us a absolute, in a nutshell, the whole overview of fertility treatment. Lifestyle, oral drugs, gonadotropins, drilling, and everything with caution, drilling with caution, gonadotropins with caution, even clomiphene and letrozole, smaller doses and then higher doses. And we got an overview of how to treat these PCOS. Now we come to the last segment, midlife problems. And I would want Dr. Sangeeta Sharma to take up this segment to answer questions. Uh, apart,
Good afternoon,
Sangeeta
ma'am.
Sharma, are you there? Hi, hi.
Yes, ma'am. Good
Apart from
afternoon,
this,
all the panelists, and
yes,
thank you so much, ma'am, for having me here as a part of this panel with so learned people there.
I think you have one of the best publications in this subject when you had hardly finished your
Yeah,
FMB
it
and
was
you
with
have
you
done
only,
such.
ma'am, under your guidance.
But it was such extensive work done by you that I thought that you should be a very good candidate to answer all these questions. So now we've already dealt with menstrual irregularities, which start at possibly mostly in adolescence, hirsutism, and then infertility also. Everything has been taken care of. She's getting regular periods, whether it is withdrawal with OCPs or progestogen. She has been taken care of her hirsutism and somewhat she's got used to it also. And infertility also has been looked after. Are there any metabolic complications related to PCOS which even after completing her family you're still worried and you would want to look into?
Yes, definitely. This is a very, very important aspect because historically it was felt that patients would mainly come with menstrual irregularities or for infertility or maybe hirsutism in the early part of their lives and adolescence. But since the last 1 to 2 decades, it has been found that PCOS is much, much more about it. So there are more important metabolic complications or long-term health implications, I would say, which first of all, it's our responsibility to be aware of them and then to educate our patients about these metabolic complications. And we as gynecologists have a very, golden window of opportunity and simultaneously a very, very important responsibility because these women would, first of all, as a primary physician, come to us because they would be having problems related to gynecology. So there we should tell them that it's not only about regularizing your periods or just having two healthy live children. The risks would continue much, much later after that also throughout your life. So then and there, it's very important to incorporate lifestyle and dietary modifications and to emphasize on these things on every clinical visit. So just to list on, obesity is there, they have an increased chances or they are at an increased risk of having impaired glucose tolerance. Type 2 diabetes is much, much more common, especially in the overweight and the obese subset. They have a higher chances of having hypertension, and at a comparatively early age, they might have myocardial infarctions and strokes, especially again in the overweight and the obese patients, along with dyslipidemia and another complication, non-alcoholic fatty liver of disease and NASH. This is also coming up in a big way nowadays, and obstructive sleep apnea. So if two important things I would have to highlight, they would be the metabolic set of complications, and a very, very important other complication would be endometrial hyperplasias and adenocarcinomas, because I'll come to that in the coming things. But due to unopposed long estrogen exposure, they have a higher chance of having endometrial hyperplasias and adenocarcinoma. So earlier it was thought to be just related to these three complaints and in the perspective of a gynecologist, but now even our own IFS guidelines have said that PCOS should be viewed as a chronic condition which requires a longitudinal treatment perspective, and creating that awareness and educating the patients is very important.
So, Sangeeta, after having told us that all these are the problems which these girls could still face in midlife after having crossed all the problems of fertility, do you suggest any screening test for metabolic complications in women with PCOS?
Yes, definitely, ma'am. And I would say that the screening should actually start whenever the diagnosis of PCOS is made, be it in adolescence or when they come to us for completion of their families, for subfertility. It's not only in midlife, but the screening should start definitely much, much before that.
How do you screen them? What are the parameters?
So the American College of Endocrinology, the ESHRE guidelines, IFS, they all have mentioned some important points in the clinical examination and some about the investigations. So a blood pressure, calculating the body mass index, the BMI, the waist circumference to rule out and see the level of obesity, and OGTT with 75 grams of glucose is extremely important along with the lipid profile. Now, ESHRE says that even a fasting blood sugar or HbA1c can be done, but still it is to be done only when OGTT is not feasible. Because when we do an oral glucose tolerance test, another added advantage is we can get an idea of impaired glucose tolerance as well. So that is the preferred one. And follow-up is also extremely important. It's not a one-time thing. If we find that these reports are all normal, we have to tell the patient to follow up annually and to repeat these examinations and investigations. And if they are borderline, we can repeat them more frequently, maybe about 6 monthly. So that is important.
You were talking about
Yes, I was talking about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So routine screening about this is not recommended. But yes, if the patient is obese and she's having other features of metabolic syndrome, definitely SGOT, SGPT, that is the aminotransferases, should be done, and a screening is must. Because
would you want to do that?
That would be a simple blood test by screening the aminotransferases, the SGOT.
How often?
That is also the same thing. If they are normal, we can repeat them annually, otherwise six monthly. But simultaneously, we also have to counsel the patient for weight reduction, because if she loses significant amount of weight, which is like 5 to 10%, this complication would also start reducing.
All right, so we come to the next question. We have very little time left. What are the different strategies to prevent the metabolic complications of PCOS?
I think
Just
for
tell me.
every complication of PCOS, the first and foremost is dietary and lifestyle modifications. So
Right.
same holds true with metabolic complications as well. And Dr. Nina has very beautifully highlighted all about the dietary and lifestyle modifications. So I would not go into the details again. But yes, keeping in mind all the patient, it should be customized, and accordingly, we should tell the patient. And the second thing is pharmacotherapy.
The drugs, would you want to add something more out of the drugs you've written, metformin and orlistat? Now
Yeah, I
after
think
listening to
metformin and orlistat are the major ones, and orlistat still has an unclear role.
Inositol?
Yes, like we have just discussed in the previous slide, so that has also come up in many papers nowadays, and which is having a better tolerability. So maybe that is one thing which can come up. For metformin, we have to give it not to all the patients with PCOS, but yes, for the patients who are having metabolic features and they are not able to reach the desired goals, the desired weight which they want to come up to just with lifestyle and dietary modification, there we can add metformin. Or if they are already at a high risk of developing type 2 diabetes, like we all Indians due to our ethnicity. Yes, ma'am.
What is the role of metformin in lean PCOS with hyperlipidemia? Is there any role in lean PCOS also? We're not talking about obese.
Definitely, ma'am. Even in lean PCOS, there is hyperinsulinemia, although lesser as compared to the obese or overweight subgroup. But there also it has a role, because if the hyperinsulinemia is taken care of, the other factors, the other risk for metabolic complications, the metabolic syndrome, and the risk for cardiovascular accidents would be a little lesser.
Yeah. Now we come to the last segment of your part. You told us that endometrial hyperplasias and adenocarcinomas are common in these women. Can you prevent these in these women? Is there any way?
Yeah. So first we should know that there is an increased risk of endometrial hyperplasias and cancers, maybe to the tune of 2 to 6 times as compared to non-PCOS. But a routine screening for any PCOS having absolutely normal menstrual cycles is not recommended. But we as gynecologists should have a very, very low threshold for investigating and screening these females for endometrial hyperplasias. So we should try to do a transvaginal scan, especially a post-menstrual one. For Indian population, a 4 millimeter cutoff is taken as a higher limit. And we should screen all patients having persistent thick endometrium or any episode of abnormal heavy vaginal bleeding, prolonged periods of amenorrhea leading to prolonged estrogen exposure, or if there is excess weight and obesity leading, because this one itself is a high risk factor for endometrial cancers and hyperplasias. So we should definitely do a transvaginal scan in these patients, and if required, a histopathology is extremely important, which can be done even as a normal procedure. It can be done even with a pipil, taking an endometrial aspirate biopsy. But if you find something polypoidal on your transvaginal scan, there in some cases you can go on to hysteroscopic guided endometrial biopsies and a hysteroscopy as well.
Otherwise, treat a hyperplasia? How would you treat her at this stage?
Yeah, so if there is an endometrial hyperplasia, we have to see that what type of hyperplasia is it, whether it is simple or a complex one, whether atypia is there or not, and accordingly, we have to give her progestogens. So before treating, I would like to come on to the prophylaxis. It's extremely important to have at least 4 menstrual cycles in a year. So the simple norm is you should give her progestogens to have a withdrawal bleeding every 3 to 4 months, which would, I think, take care of the higher risk of endometrial hyperplasias and cancers. So that is the most important message. She should have a menstrual bleeding or a withdrawal bleeding, I would say, every 3 to 4 months.
Okay, now I think we've got.
And even after having 2 children, I'm sorry to interrupt, but many of us would have patients who would complete their families have 2 children and just forget that now if the periods are not coming, what's the big deal about it? So there we have to educate them that the risk of endometrial hyperplasia and adenocarcinoma would still be there. So
Yes,
we should tell
yes.
them the importance of endometrial shedding and having menstrual periods.
Yeah, very, very nicely explained. And I'm very glad you brought home this that after having kids, they just relax and they feel menses nahi aaya, koi baat nahi, ab to koi problem nahi hai, but the problem really starts then. So, thank you very much, all my panelists, for all the answers you gave us. A lot of my doubts also cleared out. And the take home message from all the panelists now our diagnosis of PCOS in adolescents should have all three diagnostic criteria,
Not necessary.
and treatment for menstrual irregularity or hyperandrogenism should start even in the absence of confirmation of diagnosis. As soon as a girl around menarche comes with menstrual problems, we can keep confirming the diagnosis in the next years to come. OCPs or progesterone withdrawal both can be given, and they need to be continued throughout reproductive life at whatever frequency is comfortable to the patient and to the gynecologist, unless there is something which says that these drugs may have a adverse effect. So we need to keep looking for them. Approximately 70% of PCOS women will need fertility treatment. First line treatment is ovulation induction with letrozole or CC alone, and then we go to gonadotropins, but need expert monitoring, as our fertility specialist told us, drilling if other options don't work, and ART is not an option, and need to follow all PCOS with metabolic issues and treat it accordingly. Six-fold higher endometrial hyperplasia and cancers, and so screening is a must. This is all the take home I could gather from all my panelists, what they told us today. And now over to the organizers. I don't know, because we're already running out of time, whether we have more of Sky time with us so that we can continue with question and answers. Dr. Mala, you would be in a better position to tell me whether we can continue to have uh,
Thanks,
question and
madam. That
answers.
was an excellent panel. And I thank all the panelists, galaxy of panelists, because most of our doubts have been cleared. I think, ma'am, you can take 2 or 3 questions and then we can move on to the
All
next
right.
session.
All right. So, who has the chat box? Who can take the questions? Who
Ma'am, I
has the
think
chat box?
Have it yourself. You can have it. You can see the questions, Mala. Sorry, Abha, on the side. Just open the panel.
On the
You can
side.
see the,
Okay, let me
yeah.
see if I can see the questions on the
Yeah, there are
side.
lots of questions.
There are
You
45
can see,
questions
can
in the
you see
chat
the
box.
questions on the side?
45.
Yes. There are
Can you
lots
see
of
the
questions.
questions on the side?
Yes.
Then you read out the questions and then we'll see. I can't see them.
Okay.
Yeah, they're in the chat. I can see it.
Dr.
Okay,
Mala, you
anyone
can
who can
read
see
them
the
out
chat
then.
box?
Mala, you can read them out then.
Yeah, I can read them.
Okay. And stop sharing the screen, and stop sharing the slides, and I think we can go on to
Tanina,
the
you
chat.
can
Now I
share
can
now.
see the chat box.
You
Yeah,
can take the
I
first
can
I
read the
can see
first
the
question
chat
because it's
box.
pointed to me.
Yeah.
Okay. What is the first question? Doctor, excellent
Okay.
panel. Do you continue minoxidil in pregnancy like metformin till how many weeks? This is to Nina.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very pertinent question. I was kind of waiting for this time. Actually, when we did our protocol, we did not continue it because while we had done our, ethics review, we never got the permission because by then it was 2016 and 2017 when we initiated both the trials. We did not. But after that, this was part of the, postgraduate thesis and DM thesis. But I think
Yeah.
after that we went to review and we realized that myonistal can be given. However, I don't have any robust data and robust
Okay.
kind of
We can
publication to
give short
support.
answers,
But I
Nina.
think the
We just give
ideology is the
short
same.
answers.
Short answer.
We
Yeah,
need
but
short
then I
answers
think the
because
ideology remains the same. It should do good.
Okay, there is another question. What is the ideal dose of minoxidil in PCO patients? Is it 2 gram of or 4 gram? And what is the
Yes.
advantage of D-chiro-inositol along with it?
Yeah, I think it's again, if you're using Mayo alone, which we don't have, kind of companies.
For acne and hirsutism, what is the first and second line therapy? Sonia, this is to you.
In an adolescent girl, actually you are actually going to depend on the OCPs first of all, okay, and then maybe the other drugs, wherein spironolactone is something which I didn't mention, but that is very commonly used and it is
All right.
preferred as well. So therefore, the only problem with spironolactone that some girls face is that they tend to have irregular periods, and therefore you do have to give them a supplement with that.
Okay.
And
There is
then when
another
you
question we can take up quickly, which is more
yes,
important, from
yes,
Dr.
yes,
Sunita Arora. A girl of
yeah,
17 years age with treated hyperprolactinemia, MRI brain normal, with mild hirsutism, weight 80 kg with infrequent periods, endometrial thickness 4 millimeter. What is the treatment? Any one of my panelists can come up with this.
Sangeeta, you can take this one. Sangeeta, she can take this one.
I can
Or
take
maybe,
this one, or
yeah, or let
anyone
you
can
answer
take this
that.
one.
Yeah, yeah,
Sangeeta,
okay.
you take this one.
Your audio is
Connected.
Hyperprolactinemia, MRI normal, 4 thickness, OCPs
yeah,
look the best because
ACPs will
nothing
be the
else will
best.
work. Progesterone withdrawal will not work.
Not
And this
work.
is
Yes.
because of hyperprolactinemia. We can give her dopamine agonist also, bring the prolactin levels down, and maybe she will start her own periods.
I'm
In the
sorry, my
meanwhile,
mic was off. I'm sorry, I was
okay,
speaking, but
okay.
it was off. Yeah.
All right, it's all right. I have already answered the question, so we can take up another question. Do we have time, organizers?
Take
Organizers, do we have time?
that's all. Take another.
Yeah, madam, you can take one or two questions.
Okay. At what age OCPs can be started to adolescent
Let's
girls
take the lower
for
question.
hirsutism and menstrual irregularities? Anyone can take up this question. What
What was the
age can
question?
you start OCPs
Again,
for?
I
again,
think
I think when
after
it comes to
15
giving
years of
oral pills,
age,
I think we generally tend to wait them until
yeah, 15,
bone
15.
15 is what I would say, because that's what
15,
the
15.
bone age is
Okay.
a issue. So the closure is
Sonia,
there. So I think 15 is what is recommended.
Yes.
Sangeeta?
And basic,
I think 15 to 16 years is okay. If in
All
case you
right.
have to give it before that, it should be a very, very short trial, short duration for 7 days. That's what the recommendation.
Now, this is a
actually,
very
then
important
remember that
question.
the
Let's give short
irregularities.
answers. Please, short answers. Rajastri Deepak, in adolescent girls, for how long
To
should we
answer
give
this,
OC pills? Because after stopping treatment, menstrual irregularities recur. How long can you give?
see again, like we said just now, 15 is the age that we should be starting, and it can be given at intervals. At intervals, you cannot give it all continuously for say 2 years or 3 years. That would not be good. But again, you give them as we have been doing all along in our practices. That you give them for a period of 3 months or 4 months, because ideally, like Nina said, like Sangeeta said, you need to achieve 4 cycles a year, 4, maximally 6 cycles a year. It's not essential that they have to have a cycle every month. So, considering that, if you give them at intervals of 2 to 3 months, and then it keeps on there is a carryover effect of the drug for about a month or two, and then after that you can restart again. But that is how,
Okay.
because the
So
effect
this
on
is one
acne also
opinion.
takes place.
Any different opinions? Any different opinion?
Yeah,
Because
I
this is
would
a
just
very
add here.
pertinent question.
Yeah, I would just add here, giving up to 6 months. There are a lot of studies which say you do not have any problem, but yes, after 6 months, you must definitely give a grape. So up to 6 months is what most studies have shown.
Basically,
Okay.
you have to
But
think of the thromboembolism as well.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
I just have one thing, that when we start in adolescence and the girl has hirsutism, has irregular periods, there is no harm in giving it for even 2 years or 3 years, because
We
hirsutism
can,
takes time
yeah,
to come
of
down.
course,
And
of
once we
course.
stop, we've again regained the whole benefit. So if the girl is not obese, has a young girl would have very little incidence of cardiovascular disease, and if her lipid profile is normal, her sugars are normal, even if she is slightly obese, we can continue OCPs for hirsutism for 2, 3, 4 years, but keep monitoring her LFT, keep monitoring her lipid, her weight, and her OGTT every 6 months to every 1 year. This is what I feel that we can also do. Can I take up another question?
No.
Yes, ma'am.
How
Last
are we
question.
placed with time? It's already 11
Yes, madam.
minutes
Yes, madam.
past 1. We can take
You
up
can
more.
ask the question, ma'am.
If patient of PCOS does not respond to Letrose 2.5, then would you prefer 5 milligram or give her extended or step up protocol for PCOS? I don't
Yeah.
understand. This is maybe a combination protocol.
No, ma'am,
Someone is
there is a
asking.
protocol. No, this is known. Actually, if you look at literature, the recommended doses of letrozole are anything between 2.5 to 7.5. In our country, because the DGSA has approved only 2.5, we're giving. Where if your patient does not respond to 2.5, or the 2.5 5 days to 10 days. That's what is called the extended regime, and these are both accepted. So, if it doesn't respond, it's a good idea to give her from day 3, go on for 10 days with letrozole, 2.5, or increase it to 5 for 5 days.
How many cycles would you want to use letrozole for?
Well, if you look at the paper which are coming from both Kaspar's group as well as the Egyptian, guys group, they have gone in up to 3 to 6 cycles, and
What
they
do
found
you
that this
use?
works.
What do you
Yeah,
use?
well, I
Your
use 2.5.
experience.
I use
And how
2.5,
many
and if I'm not
cycles?
happy, and I would just add in gonadotropin in the next. I wouldn't go in for
How many
5.
cycles?
I
How
would just
many
go to 3
cycles?
cycles,
3
and
cycles.
I would
Okay.
again add. I would again add. These are patients who don't respond to letrozole, are typically the CC resistant. They are the ones who are CC resistant. So you have to look at
Reload
it.
कर
If you
सकते
add
हैं
in,
इसको?
Can I
Let's
just
have
say
short
if you
one?
add
answers,
in,
please. We have
if you
very little
if you
time.
One
add in
word.
insulin sensitizers, if you add in
Preferable
insulin
OC pill in
sensitizers, it does you good.
adolescents. Someone would answer. Preferable OC pill in adolescent age group. What do you use? All of you, anyone can come
10-year-old
up and
girl.
answer.
10-year-old girl, Malak. Sorry, Abha. 10-year-old girl.
10 I won't prefer. 10 year I will not use.
Okay.
No, 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 no.
10
Not
no.
in a
No.
10-year-old girl. Not in
Okay.
a 10-year-old.
Right. Correct. Very important. No OC pill
Yes.
for a 10-year-old girl. What can you give instead of OC pill? She
Nothing.
has.
Just observe. Just observe. Just
Oh, she's
observe.
bleeding a lot. She's bleeding a lot. She's not stopping to bleed.
Then progesterone, you have to control it with
Yes.
progesterone. You have to control it with
Yes.
progesterone. That's it.
Yeah.
But that
This
that
is
is
very
this is not a
important.
PCO. This is puberty menorrhagia. This is puberty
Right.
menorrhagia. Okay.
Correct. Very important. If she's bleeding a
Yeah.
lot, just progestogen. And don't have to give her withdrawal if she doesn't have a withdrawal, maybe has one period at 9 years age or
Yes.
9.5 and doesn't have it at 10, then you don't need to give anything. Just give her progesterone withdrawal, and if she bleeds a lot, progesterone menorrhagia to be
Later on.
treated with
Later.
progesterone only. Any other important question does anyone see on the board? Coenzyme Q10, I don't think we need to talk about this. I think we've done with our panel, and
Thanks, madam, for that wonderful panel. And I'm sure all our audience have benefited immensely. We can go on to the next session of the day. I
Thank you very
invite
much.
Dr.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We can go on to the next session of the day. The next section, I'll invite our chairperson, Dr. Neeti Tiwari. She's a consultant, Department of IVF and Human Reproduction, Sir Gangaram Hospital. She has many awards to her credit, and she has many publications in national and international journals. Over to you, Dr. Neeti, for the next proceedings.
Good afternoon, everyone.
हेलो अभय अभी भी नहीं हो रहा है
Am I audible?
Oh,
yeah,
अच्छा
you
थोड़ा
are audible, Neeti, very well
So-
audible.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you all are in good health and keeping faith through these difficult times. So now we are moving on from a situation which was of androgen axis, that is PCOS, to a condition where maybe the androgens are not enough, that is poor responders. Poor responders have always been a challenge to manage for an IVF clinician. Dr. Abha Majumdar will now deliver a talk on role of androgens in poor responder. Dr. Abha Majumdar is the director and head of the Center of IVF and Human Reproduction, Sir Gangaram Hospital. She has many awards, many publications in her name, and she's a teacher par excellence who has students spread all across India. So over to Dr. Abha Majumdar for the role of androgens in poor responder.
Thank you, Neeti, for the introduction. And I love this topic, and I would be very happy to share what I know about this. Can you see the screen? Can you see the slide?
We can see the screen, ma'am. Yeah, we can see
All
the
right.
screen.
Thank you very much. And again, good afternoon and namaste to all my delegates. I would love to give a lecture on role of androgens in poor responder, very close to my heart because I use it a lot. And to start off, when we're talking about poor ovarian response, then there are two important terminologies which come into our mind, and one is poor ovarian reserve and the other is poor ovarian response. What is poor ovarian reserve? Well, poor ovarian reserve is a condition which we do test for ovarian reserve and we see, oh, there is a poor reserve, low ovarian volume, low antral follicle count, low AMH, the FSH looks higher, and the age is also more. What is poor ovarian response? Ovarian reserve tests are okay. Everything looks all right. FSH also normal. But the moment we start stimulating her for IVF, especially when we give high doses for stimulation, the conventional high dose, we find very poor response in terms of follicular formation and oocyte collected. So a lot of people were facing this problem all through the world, and the experts had to get together to say that there is a segment where we get poor ovarian response. And in Bologna, the ESHRI consensus meeting happened, which was by all the Europeans, and they made a definition of poor response to ovarian stimulation in IVF, which was known as the Bologna criteria also. It was published in Human Reproduction in 2011, which said that poor ovarian response refers to the ovarian response, and therefore one stimulated cycle is considered essential for the diagnosis of poor ovarian response. And here it took into consideration the woman's age, her number of oocytes, and her reserve also. But then this just did not tell us everything about a response, because we feel that if there is poor ovarian reserve and there is poor response, it is okay, understood. But when we say there is normal ovarian reserve and poor ovarian response, then the Bologna goes for a toss. We don't know how to say with all normal reserve, why did the response become poor? And hence, we thought that something more is required to explain a poor response in women with normal ovarian reserve. And then came up another group, the Poseidon group, which was published in the Fertile Sterile in 2016, which said we have 4 groups of patients, not just one group which qualifies Bologna, but we have 4 groups of patients with lower prognosis in terms of ovarian response to controlled ovarian stimulation for IVF. And the first group is women who have a good reserve. Group 1 and Group 2 have good reserve. One group is below 35, the other group is above 35. This is the only difference. Their AMH is normal, the AFC is normal, and but then when we stimulate them, we have an unexpected poor ovarian response or a suboptimal response. They also subdivided this into subgroup A and B, where they said 4 or less oocytes was really poor response, 5 to 9 also was poor response in a patient with normal ovarian reserve and standard conventional stimulation. Group 3 and Group 4 were patients who had a poor reserve to start with. Less than 35 and more than 35 divided them into Group 3 and 4, but all of them had a poor ovarian reserve in terms of AFC and AMH and age, and when we stimulated, both of them showed a poor response. This was still understood. Group 1 and Group 2 looked abnormal to us and was not understood. And as we think which one should we treat, possibly it is group 1 and group 2, where we might find a treatment option where even with a good reserve, they had a poor response, and we might make their response better. So we thought, let us target group 1 and group 2 at least, where the reserve looked all right, but on stimulation every time they responded poorly. And as it is in all subjects, when we don't have an answer to a problem, we bring genetics into our understanding of problems. And it was seen that some of these patients had higher exogenous FSH consumption if they were carriers of FSH receptor serine 680 variant or a 5 beta LH variant. If they had these two underlying mutations in their receptors, then they responded differently to the standard dose of gonadotropins and responded very poorly. So we started looking at genetics of these women who had normal reserve and responded poorly, whether they were carriers for this. However, we have still studies ongoing in these two subjects, and maybe later on when this analysis will be available very easily to us, like AMHs, we may be able to identify that subgroup which could respond poorly and would require higher doses for stimulation and the same response. Well, what is the evidence-based proposed adjuvants in such patients who have a poor response? It is androgen pre-treatment, addition of LH from day 1 of stimulation, and growth hormone from start of stimulation. Our main topic today is androgen pre-treatment in these cases which appear poor responders and may have a normal or poor reserve either way. So androgens and poor responders, studies suggest androgen pre-treatment may amplify FSH effect on the human ovary. Whether it is testosterone, dermal patches or gel, whether it is dehydroepiandrosterone, which is given orally, or it is letrozole, which leads to androgen accumulation in the early follicular phase in the ovary while stimulating orally. So let us go to what is the ovulatory performance in primates who are very close to us. Granulosa cell stimulation by FSH is an androgen modulated process in the primate ovary. This was known many years ago. But now it is very well known that testosterone augments follicular FSH receptor expression and sensitivity in granulosa cells. If anything which makes these follicular cells more sensitive to the FSH which is coming from the pituitary, we will have a better response. It also promotes initiation of primordial follicular growth into preantral and small antral follicles, which are the ones which are sensitive to gonadotropin, and hence the growth starts. The growth spurt starts on giving gonadotropins. These are two landmark studies which were done by Hughes et al. In 2004 and Balash et al. In 2006. Look at the difference in these two. They use testosterone patches, and very important differences were there. Like Hughes said, poor responders if previous cycle had less than 4 oocytes, and all these patients had high basal hormones. At that time, we did not have AMH, so they said FSH was less than 20 and age was less than 41. So look at them. In today's Poseidon group, they would both come into group 3 and 4. And here, what did he use? 15 milligrams per day of testosterone patch for 15 days prior to ovarian stimulation. And he found no difference on oocyte recovery or pregnancy rates. On the other hand, Balash, 2 years later, modified the whole thing. He said, a poor responder I would define if 2 previous IVF cycles were cancelled because less than 3 oocytes were obtained. And he took patients with normal basal hormones, less than 10 MIU. So this was the Poseidon group 1 and 2 now. And what did he use? A lower dose of testosterone for less number of days. 12 milligram a day for 5 days prior to stimulation. What did he get? Oocyte recovery of 80%, pregnancy rate of 30% in his group. So this gave us a lot of food for thought. And we thought that the daily dose, timing, and duration of androgen supplementation may be critical to adequately stimulate folliculogenesis. And it has been seen and has been published in endocrinological journals that chronic administration of high dose of androgen is antagonistic to gonadotropin-stimulated ovarian function in primates. So this is what happens in PCOS. High doses of androgen is exposed to them, and hence the gonadotropin just can't stimulate the ovaries. And this is what happens if we give high doses in the initial part of stimulation. And there is a threshold effect of androgen for follicular function. It's a very delicate threshold. Agonist action of androgen at lower levels, the moment we increase androgen levels, there is an antagonistic action of gonadotropin stimulation in these primates. And hence, if we give too much of androgen, we may have poor response. If we give less androgens, we may have a good response. Now, I thought let us bring up this review where they could identify only 3 RCTs which could be sort of identified as proper RCTs, and they enrolled 221 subjects for a review in 2014 by Shan Liu. And what did they say? That if they used transdermal testosterone, twofold increase in live birth rate, twofold increase in clinical pregnancy rate, and significantly more oocytes retrieved. Now, here we just go across it that they use transdermal patches, and these are the 3 studies where you can see that in the first study they used GnRH long agonist protocol. They used 1 milligram per day only of testosterone for 15 to 20 days preceding ovarian stimulation, where in the second one they used 2.5 milligram but only for 5 days. So they reduced the duration but increased the dose, and hence both of them got good results. Third study used antagonist protocol, where they used 1.25 milligram, a midway dose between the first 2 studies, and they used an antagonist protocol here for these patients, and they used this 1.25 milligram per day for 21 days preceding ovarian stimulation with the OC pill. And this much of androgen was enough to make the follicles more sensitive to whatever dose of gonadotropin one was using to stimulate the follicles. Then we stimulated by all these studies. We did our own work, and this was way back in 2014. This paper was presented in IFFS, and here what we did was we took agonist protocol, and if you see, we just did it on 9 cases, where in the first cycle we could not even do a embryo transfer in 4 patients, whereas after pre-treatment, what happened, we got a positive pregnancy in 4 cases, out of which there was only 1 abortion and 3 patients continued. So we used patches. We used the same dose as Balash had used, that is just for 5 days, 2.5 milligram patch, and it really worked. But then very soon after this study, the patches disappeared from the market, and we couldn't really prolong this study anymore. Now, androgen pre-treatment in poor responders. Let's see what is the role of letrozole. Letrozole, again, we all know it prevents the conversion of androgen to estrogen at the follicular level on start of stimulation, and hence increases the androgen substrate to the follicles so that the gonadotropins coming from the pituitary act better, the follicles become more sensitive. And Mitwali and Casper, who were the founders of letrozole, who first introduced letrozole to all of us, have shown that if it is given with gonadotropins for just even 5 initial days, then temporary accumulation of intraovarian androgen improves IVF outcome in low responders. That is with low FSH or with poor response in the previous cycle. But then now we come to dehydroepiandrosterone, which is so commonly used by all of us, and it is very easy to use. So I thought of bringing in a study where this could also be evaluated, and we could see what is the effect of this drug given in poor responders. What is recommended is 75 milligram per day for 2 to 3 months, and then stimulate the ovaries while still on dehydroepiandrosterone. And better response was seen by Kaysen, published in Human Reproduction, in women who had a FSH lower than 20, age less than 41, and were poor responders. But then I thought of looking into a meta-analysis, and here again in this I could find only 3 controlled studies were eligible for meta-analysis. There was no significant difference in clinical pregnancy rate and miscarriage rate between women pre-treated with DHEA compared to those without DHEA pre-treatment. The number of oocytes retrieved was significantly lower in the DHEA group. So we couldn't conclude anything that DHEA was still good or not. So I thought, let me analyze all these 3 cycles and see what really happened. And when I analyzed, I found this study, which was by Weiser et al., out of these 3 studies, which showed a very important benefit. And yet, it couldn't bring out an impact on the meta-analysis result because the numbers of the other 2 studies outweighed this study. This was a randomized prospective study where they used dihydroepiandrosterone supplementation, and it showed a beneficial effect on the live birth rate. And they said that this drug should be considered for poor responder patients due to its simplicity of use and lack of side effects. Additional large studies are required to reinforce this finding. Here they use DHEA 75 milligram once daily for at least 6 weeks before starting ovarian stimulation for a maximum of 16 to 18 weeks. So no more DHEAs for more than 16 to 18 weeks, which means 4 calendar months. Please do not go on giving this because androgens will collect, and then maybe instead of good response, one may get a poor response. Having said that, the androgens, the editorial group of Cochrane Gynecology and Fertility Group said that in women identified as poor responders undergoing ART, pre-treatment with DHEA or testosterone may be associated with improved live birth rates. The overall quality of evidence is moderate, but there is insufficient evidence to draw any conclusions about the safety of either androgen. Definitive conclusions regarding the clinical role of either androgen awaits evidence from further well-designed studies. I'll come to the end of my talk because I was given that this is the time frame I have to finish my talk in. So let us see whether we still have time for question and answers. My take-home message is a subset of poor responders have adequate ovarian reserve, that is Poseidon group 1 and 2, but appear as poor responders on stimulation. A possible genetic background is being explored to answer the occurrence of poor response with adequate appearing ovarian reserve. There is mounting evidence to say that pre-treatment with androgens may improve ART outcome by providing more androgen substrate to a subset of low responders who would need this. And thank you all for a patient hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a wonderful and a very crisp presentation on role of androgen. Somehow I think we don't have many IVF specialists log in today, so no questions have come up for your lecture. But I have 2 questions from my side. One is that, some people criticize that is it right to give androgens without testing the levels? Should the androgen levels be tested in women before giving them?
Neeti, this is such an important question, and at one time it was thought that levels are important, but this is not what we see in blood. We don't need the androgen levels in blood. This is intra-ovarian androgen, and hence there is no reason to do a blood level for androgens, whether it is DHEAs or it is testosterone, because the blood levels will not indicate the intra-ovarian androgen presence, and then all poor responders will not respond to androgen pre-therapy. It would be possibly a subset of women where intra-ovarian androgen accumulation is less, but then on the other hand, we don't have any adverse effects unless we give high doses for a long time. So it appears a possible treatment therapy for girls where growth hormone is not available, where you may try either LH from day 1 of stimulation, and if that doesn't help, then maybe androgens will come to your rescue in such patients where the parameters look all right or normal or low normal, and yet the response is very poor. So there's no reason to say blood levels will help much.
And one more question, ma'am. In terms of safety, how will you compare a testosterone patch to DHEAs? Because people say that DHEAs is a milder androgen, so even if given for like 3 months, it doesn't accumulate to a level which could be harmful. But testosterone, suppose it is given in a higher dose, a patient takes it by mistake in a higher dose, can have a detrimental effect and a positive effect as compared to doing any benefit.
Very important question again raised, Neeti. Very important question raised. You are very right in saying that testosterone patch is high dose of testosterone and should not be given unless medically supervised. DHEA, on the other hand, is almost a nutritional agent. So people can take without a prescription, they can buy without a prescription, but yet, yes, a word of warning that if you're using for fertility purposes, don't use it for more than 4 or 5 months in a stretch, because that might not help any later. And DHEAS really doesn't give rise to any androgenic symptoms in general, because it, like you said, it clears out from blood very easily. So it's much safer by general gynecologists to use DHEAS rather than testosterone patch, which should always be used by a specialist under supervision.
Ma'am, some questions have come up for us also. So one question is coming from Dr. Neena Malhotra. She's asking, what is your preference of androgen? What do you prefer as an androgen when you give it?
Well, I loved to use a patch when it was available, but it's gone. So maybe my unit is trying to do a study with the gel, but then we need
You're not able to calibrate the
we
levels.
need to get good answers before we can say that gel will work, because we don't have that minuscule dose of the gel available which is required for these patients. So DHEAS becomes the treatment of choice. But yes, I have used letrozole a lot in my IVF cycles, where I use just for 5 days 2.5 milligrams in so-called poor responders, even with low reserve patients, start gonadotropins along with it. And in some cases, we did show better follicular recruitment and oocyte recovery, but it was not statistically significant when we compared it to the LH group. We used these two drugs, in a study which is going to be published in Fertility Sterility. It has been accepted. It was sponsored by Merck Serono for us, where we used recombinant LH along with gonadotropin on one hand, and on the other hand, we used letrozole. And this study has already gone for publication, which showed that LH is better. And because we got that result, Merck Serono took up the responsibility of sponsoring and getting it published also. But then even letrozole group looked promising to me. Those statistics didn't favor letrozole.
Ma'am, one question is there an age limit in poor responder for use of DHEA? And what is the role of AMH? Should we check AMH to see whether it has helped? I think that is the question.
I don't think AMH will change after using DHEA. After using testosterone patches, people have seen an increase in the antral follicle count, a change in antral follicle count, I'll say. But these are very small studies which say that there have been an improvement in the antral follicular count. So with DHEA, I don't think we get a very big change in ovarian volume or antral follicle count or in AMH at all. And age limit, well, as long as the woman has her regular cycles, has FSH in an acceptable limit, and wants to try fertility, we cannot deny it to anyone, even if they are over 41.
Okay. Dr. Gleischer is a very strong proponent of DHEA, and he has shown studies which says that AMH does get better. He has shown that, but yes, that happens in women who are younger, not in women who are older, like group 3, 4, group 1 and 2, the AMH, not the younger women, the AMH do get better in these.
Yeah, so it is same like the smaller studies I said do show an increase in antral follicle count and preantral follicles. We can't see preantral follicles, but I'm definite if preantral follicles increase and antral follicles increase, then AMH is a representation from preantral and antral follicles both, whereas ultrasound can only assess antral follicles. So if antral follicles increase, then I'm sure that preantral also increases, and therefore AMH also should increase.
AMH should go high.
Yeah.
One question is, how is your experience with testosterone gel that we have already given, and what is the dose of testosterone you advise in these patients, ma'am? The dose of testosterone.
Not by people who don't have much experience with ovarian stimulation in IVF patients. It has to be used mostly in IVF patients. Only testosterone gels or patches have been tried, not for just normal ovarian stimulation. So one is, please let it remain with the IVF specialist only while stimulation, because it is like you said earlier that it could give androgenic side effects, and the woman might suffer with hyperandrogenic effects much more with the testosterone patch, because testosterone is a much more potent androgen as compared to DHEAS.
And one question is if you have both growth hormone and androgen with you, which will you prefer in your poor responder?
Androgen,
That will answer
androgen
Dr. Nina's
because
question also. She wanted to know. She wanted to know your
yeah,
call on GH, growth hormone.
I think we need to do more studies. We need to be more confident. I am not very confident with growth hormone. One is because of the cost. Cost is not so important. Two is that the patient has to take number of injections, 3 injections with the growth hormone coming in. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Shweta, has tried growth hormones in some women with variable results. Maybe one or
Very,
two
very
cycles
good.
she did get a good result, and one or two she got no results. So I wouldn't really venture much into growth hormone till we really find other people who can spend more money, who can have sponsored RCTs to say that growth hormone is really good and we must give it a try. I haven't given it a try except a couple of cycles here and there. In the earlier days,
And
not now anymore for the last 10 years.
one question is that if we are saying that letrozole leads to monofollicular development, how you are using it in IVF cycle? I think that they have not understood that we give it together with
No,
the
no, 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 no,
FSH.
no. Letrozole
They're
gives you
saying, but if it is,
monofollicular
yeah,
development.
yeah,
Right,
yeah. So they are
very
saying if
correct.
how is how it's a yeah it's a so they are saying that if it is it does monofollicular development, how it benefits in a IVF cycle. That is the question.
Okay, so I was trying to open up the chat box. All right. So, see, letrozole is only being used here not for follicular development, but it is being used to accumulate
Yeah.
androgen in the early
And we are
follicular
giving
phase so that
FSH. We are giving
gonadotropins act
FSH.
better on that.
It is not that we are giving it in a sequential way or, we are
No,
giving
no.
letrozole and FSH together. We are giving it together.
Yeah,
Uh,
so that it just accumulates more androgens in the first half of the follicular phase, and gonadotropins, which we are giving in doses of 225 or 300 international units to these poor responders, would act better on the same follicles because of androgen making the follicles more sensitive to gonadotropins.
yeah. Ma'am, if we suspect FSH LH polymorphism, can we test it? And how do we change the type of gonadotropin?
Well, there is Ramaraju has done the highest amount of work in our country on receptor polymorphism, and he has also published this in Fertility Sterility. We got 75 cases tested through Dr. Ramaraju because this was an expensive test, and we asked one of the drug companies to sponsor this test, and uh, we really did not find the type of receptor testing he was doing did not show any correlation with. We only chose poor responders where AMH was normal and we had less than 4 oocytes recovered. And we really did not find a correlation with the type of receptor he was testing because he was not testing FSH serine receptor serine 450. He was testing a different receptor. That
LHCGR.
receptor
He
showed
was
no
setting
correlation.
LHCGR, yeah.
LHCGR, which is a
CGR.
different receptor, and that showed no correlation. So we really don't have a test available for general clinicians to use like us. And I hope if we have a good study and a good receptor test available, a good study to say that this receptor mutation leads to poor response by the traditional doses of gonadotropin, then we could use it like we use AMH. The moment we get a poor response, we do this receptor study and we see this receptor is present, we increase a gonadotropin dose because that is the only way. You either increase the gonadotropin dose or you add a LH containing molecule, and generally they say not a HCG containing molecule but a LH containing, which
LH.
gives us again in recombinant LH only. So either we have to target or attack from another mode by giving LH molecule, or we increase FSH so that it overcomes that retarded effect which the gene mutation or polymorphism is doing on the receptor for the normal
So
gonadotropin, which is
in
coming from
case
the
these
pituitary.
tests are not available to us, in case these tests are not available to us and we have found an unexplained poor response in our patient, first of all, we can increase the dose of FSH
Right.
and then we can think of adding LH also in the next cycle.
Yes. And there they say LH
Okay.
has to be in good doses, not just 75 international units maybe as much as 150 international units, which makes the cycle expensive, but it has to be added from day one of gonadotropin stimulation. So either increase the dose on one side and add LH on the other side. You can do both, or you do one at a time and see what helps you most.
Okay, ma'am, I think we have taken almost all the questions. We have bombarded you and we got the
Yeah.
answers. Thank you so much. And thank you, the organizers, for giving me this opportunity to interact with
Thanks,
everyone. It was a
everybody.
great experience.
I think we had a very wonderful session, and I thank Dr. Abha. Ma'am has taken the responsibility of conducting the panel and doing this lecture as well. Thanks everybody, my chairpersons, the panelists, everybody. And I also thanks my viewers who has been giving actual questions and making it very interactive session. Finally, I thank Sun Pharma Inca Division for sponsoring this session. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, madam. Thank you on behalf of Sun Pharma and Green. I thanks